on the crucial relationship between the chair and the CEO. Welcome to the Better Boards podcast series, the podcast for chairs, CEOs, non-executive directors, company secretaries and their advisors. Every episode is filled with practical insights and learnings from those inside boardrooms. We discuss what really matters and highlight actionable steps you can take to enhance the performance of your board. The board is responsible for appointing the CEO. The relationship between the chair and the CEO is crucial, but often not easy. In this episode, I talk with a highly experienced chair about this crucial relationship between the chair and the CEO. My podcast partner talks about what matters when selecting a CEO, what he does and what he has seen working in establishing and developing really good relationships between him and the CEO. I'm delighted to talk with Sir David Norgrove. Sir David Norgrove was for a long time a director at Britain's beloved retailer Marks & Spencer, and since retiring from that role has taken up many roles on public and private boards, mainly public boards, where he was chair, non-executive director, and made a real difference. So I'm absolutely delighted to have him on the Better Boards podcast series. Sir David, it's a huge honor to have us on the Better Board podcast series. Thank you so much for contributing.
It's a pleasure.
You have seen both sides of the fence, Sir David. What I mean by this, you have been an executive, you have been a director, and you have been a chair. When you were an executive and director at Britain's much beloved retailer, Marks & Spencer, how did you experience your chair at the time? Can you recall?
Yes, I had three chairs during my 16 years at M&S. In fact, all three of them were joint chair and chief executive, much against the current grain. The third one split the role eventually. But I saw the downsides of that, I think, certainly with the first two, who were both dictatorial characters, very strong personalities. And I saw the downside of that in the form of their reluctance to allow challenging and questioning of what they decided. And the board, too often, I think, certainly for the first two, was a rubber stamp. But what I think I did learn from the first two particularly was their commitment to getting inside the guts of the business. And so in a retail business particularly, it's important to be on the shop floor and to see what's going on, as well as to get involved with what you're trying to sell. And I think that was one thing that I learned very strongly from them, was the need to get out and about, to understand what the business, what the organization is about, to meet the people, to take the flavor as well as picking up issues. And I don't think I ever went to a store, and I went to stores every week, without coming back with something that gave me something to look into or to ask about or to do something about. And I took that with me, I think, into all of my later jobs.
Wow. I hear very often of these, what I call almost stage events. So once or twice a year, the board and the directors go to a site or a plant, but then everything is pre-prepared and almost some people they meet are hand-selected. I hear less and less that people take the time to really go into the business just as an observer in the normal business context, or as a client or customer. I mean, try out the product.
Well, I agree. Certainly for a retail business. I mean, I guess it's more difficult if it's a chemical company, but in a retail business, you can, you can go out and work on the shop floor, and we all expected to, and I enjoyed it, going out for a week or two at Christmas and serving customers on the shop floor. You learned a lot from that. But we generally, all the senior management anyway, went out on a Saturday morning visiting stores, and we're very often out in stores on a Friday as well. And I think that was immensely valuable. I think the sort of formal away days on a site, on a company site, where lots of people work, has its place, because it signals to people that you care, that the board cares about them, that it's interested in them. But the one-on-one, the wandering around, is just as important, if not more so.
Yeah. Going back to your experience when you were an executive, was there anything that really annoyed you and that really stayed in your memory? You hinted that these were strong characters, but were there other behaviors or things they did, particularly in the boardroom, that you found hugely annoying?
Well, it was a long time ago, and I think the standards were different, and some of the behaviour I thought was not really acceptable. There was a sense of bullying too often. The dictatorship, the dictatorial approach, sort of tipped over the edge even beyond that, and I think it was immensely damaging to the business. That was something that I took with me.
Do you think it's completely gone? Because sometimes I see it is a dictatorial approach, but people have been more clever on how they perform that role.
Yes, I think it's less prevalent in the public sector organisations I've worked in since. But I haven't really been in. Well, I've seen a bit of private sector, some companies where I think, yes, you're right. The dictatorial approach is subtle, but it's still there. But on the other hand, I think progress has been made. I think people do now genuinely accept the need to listen and to work in teams. I think there's much more openness now than there was 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, I would agree on that. But I still see traces, I have to confess. And I think, oh, God, it has become a lot more sophisticated. But
yes.
In a way, it's there.
Yeah.
So, David, you served and you serve on amazing institutions in the UK. What motivates you in the first place to take on these roles? I mean, you could travel the world, have a nice time with your family and not bother.
Oh, well, I do that too.
That's good.
I mean, that's the nice thing about being a non-executive, really, that you have a bit more flexibility. And one of the Latin poets said that those who travel the world change the scenery, but not their frame of mind. So, yes. So what motivates me? It really interest. I choose things to do now. I'm fortunate that I don't need the money. So I do things that interest me, that, for example, being involved with the British Museum for many years, all of the jobs that I've done actually since I've retired have interested me, and they matter. And also I look for things that I hope play to my strengths. So those are my criteria, really. And I feel very privileged to be able to have them.
I mean, coming back to our topic about this crucial relationship between the chair and the CEO, you had to appoint quite some CEOs in your time.
Yes.
What are you looking for in a CEO?
Well, I suppose the first thing I'd say is that having the right CEO is for me the number 1, 2, and 3 most important things for a chair. Because if you've got the wrong CEO, the relationship may break down, but more important, the organisation may well turn out to be unhappy and not deliver its objectives. So it's critical to have the right CEO. And I don't really have a lot of wisdom about it. I mean, the risk with sort of listing a set of characteristics is that you look for the sort of entrepreneurialism and drive of an Elon Musk combined with the human understanding of a Buddha. The two things can't coexist. So you're always making trade-offs. But I think I do look for certain qualities in the CEOs I've appointed to. One is a directness, a willingness not to beat about the bush, to tell you what's going on. Because I think if there's a lack of honesty there, if you feel that you can't trust the person you're appointing, then it's doomed. You have to be able to trust them. So that's the sort of foundation of the relationship. And then I look for people who meet the key criteria that I've, in my own mind, and often with the panel, we've decided are the critical things that this person must have. And sometimes, of course, you just have to compromise a bit because you don't necessarily get everything. But there are always a couple of things, 2 or 3 things that you say, without that, not. And then you go out and re-recruit.
So how do you do it? So, of course, you're well connected, you know a lot of people, but basically a headhunter suggests now a candidate. How do you manage to get under their skin and understand if they fulfill your criteria and if this trust element is really there.
Well, a lot of that, however, I mean, any interview process or even meeting the people beforehand or whatever is never going to give you absolute certainty. All you can do is trust your instinct, and that can be wrong. So you have to go on instinct, but then you have to have a process. And the process in the public sector organisations is actually, I think, less satisfactory in some ways than in a private sector organisation, in that where you can spend time with the candidates, you can wander around the shop floor, so to speak, with them. You can have lunch with them or go to coffee or whatever it is. So you can get to know the shortlist better than you can in the public sector, where there's a much more formal process where you have you may have a conversation. If you're the chair and you're appointing the CEO, you do get to have a conversation with them beforehand, but it might only be a half an hour, three-quarters of an hour. And then you're into a panel with a formality and the set of questions that doesn't necessarily bring out the best in the people you're interviewing. It may not show the things that you need them to show. So I think there's a higher risk in that public sector process than there is often in the private sector process. Inevitably, it's hard and it can go wrong. I mean, we see it, all of us, don't we? Time after time, that somebody's appointed and within a year or two they're gone. So there's no magic solution to that. I do remember reading an account in the New Yorker in the 1970s of an experiment where several thousand people were filmed, several thousand interviews were filmed for various jobs. And then the interviews were shown to groups of people without them knowing what the job was for, even. And they were asked to predict who got the job. And they were sort of 80%, 90% right. And then they cut the length of the film that was shown back. And they got to the point where people opened the door and said nothing. And they were still 60 or 70% correct.
Wow.
So we make instant judgments.
I can remember a long, long time ago, right after my doctorate, I was going for my first job and I interviewed with a headhunter. And I thought at the time, God, what an arrogant guy. It was in a three-piece suit. He was smoking a cigar. And he talked about the boardroom smell. He said, because I asked him pretty much the same question, how do you know that the candidate is right? And he absolutely confirmed what you said. He said, when people come through the door, I instantly know if they have the boardroom smell or if they don't.
Well, that's so arrogant, isn't it? But we're all at risk of doing that.
I mean, the old saying, first impressions count, yeah? Just confirmation,
yeah? Yes.
Now, once you've appointed them, what do you do to really develop and maintain good relationship with the CEO? Because this relationship, as you said, is so, so crucial.
Well, it has to vary a bit by the character of the CEO, doesn't it? It's a relationship, so you're not going to be the same with everybody. But I suppose there are two things that I try to do. One is always have an almost sacrosanct meeting, even if it's only a phone call, once a week with the CEO at least. So I don't want too much time to go by without sitting down or having a conversation about what's going on in the business and what my concerns might be, what's on his mind or her mind and what's on my mind. And the other is, I know that at some stage I can be too directive. And I had a mentor when I was first appointed to the board at M&S who pointed this out to me. And he gave me a piece of plastic, a laminated picture of a man called Robin Day, who was a question master. I think he might even have been chair of, run Question Time. And this was to tell me that my role was now to ask questions, much more than to tell people what to do. And I tried to live by that, to ask questions rather than to push too hard in any one direction. I mean, sometimes you have to do that, but to try to leave it open, because I think, after all, the person you're talking to is the chief executive. he's not your underling, or she's not your underling. They're the chief executive. They're in charge of the business or the organization. They're the people who've got to deliver. And it's often much more productive to ask them questions than to try to steer them too directly.
So that is what you do as a chair. What, in your view, can the CEO do to maintain and to develop and maintain this good relationship with a chair? If any CEOs are listening to our podcast, what advice would you give them, or what tip would you give them?
Well, they have to know their chair, don't they? And maybe different chairs have different requirements or different needs. But if it were me, I would say, tell me what's going on. Don't try to cover things up. Just tell me the truth, because then we can tackle it together. Or otherwise, once trust is gone, it's very hard to recover it.
Yeah.
And loss of trust, in my mind, is the unforgivable sin.
And is there anything the other directors on the board can do to support the good relationship between the chair and the CEO? Is there anything they can do?
That's more difficult because they tend to have much less contact with the CEO than the chair does necessarily. I think I've sometimes found it very helpful that a non-executive director's had a word with me about how the CEO is feeling, what they've picked up from other people in the organization, even from the CEO themselves, about something that I've done or I'm doing that is challenging the relationship with the CEO. So they can be supportive in that way, I think. Once or twice I've got too involved in the guts of the organization and started to get too much into the detail. And I've been told by a non-executive director that the CEO doesn't like it. And then I'll raise that with the CEO and we'll discuss it and come to an agreement about what's appropriate. So I think that has been helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important point, because I heard that very often after COVID, after a crisis, after an organization had a difficult time. Chairs or directors get sometimes too much involved and then don't understand when it's time to let loose again.
And that comes from anxiety, doesn't it? It comes from being anxious about whether the CEO or the relevant director is doing what's needed to put things right.
Yeah.
And that's where the honesty comes in again from the CEO in terms of being clear about the progress that's being made or not.
When you meet the CEO, do you do it mainly virtually these days, or do you do it physically? Do you go out and have lunch with them, or breakfast or dinners, or what do you do?
No, I'm not. At the moment, I'm not chairing a large organization. I'm chairing a very small one. And people are based mostly in Scotland, but also in England. And I'll have a phone. Actually, most of the time I have a phone conversation with him. So I've got one in an hour's time with him, which is my meeting with him this week. But occasionally we'll meet, but not very often. I mean, it is a very small organisation, so there's less pressure for that than if the organisation is a large one.
And when you were with larger organizations, did you spend more time physically together? Because it's a question I very often get. How much can you do virtually, really, and how much value is in physical meetings?
Well, of course, with a large organisation, invariably there would be, say, 10 or 11 board meetings a year. So one physical meeting, and we would sit down usually before or after the board meeting for an hour and chew things over. And then quite often there'd be another meeting necessarily during the month. So probably 2 physical meetings a month. And I found that enough, actually.
That's super. Very, very helpful. So, David, at the end, there's always one question. That's the tradition on the podcast, which is a tough one. What are the 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast?
Well, it feels a bit arrogant to come out with sort of 3 lessons, but I'm not sure I can come out with 3. I thought 2, really. One was have the right CEO. Easier said than done. But if the CEO isn't right, maybe it's you who have to go, maybe it's the chair who has to go. But if it's not the chair going, then the CEO should go, and that bullet needs to be dealt with. That problem needs. If the CEO is wrong, and by that I mean fundamentally wrong, there's no point in continuing one way or the other. And the second, I think, is to ask questions. Well, I suppose that leads to a third one, which is get out and about, go and visit the places where the organisation is at, and sit down with people, get them to tell you what they're doing. There's no substitute for it.
Fantastic. Sir David, thank you so much for contributing to the BetterBots podcast series.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. I enjoyed thinking about it.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. If you have any questions, please do get in touch. Your questions can be about the podcast, about the topic we just discussed, or if you would like to hear about what we are actually doing as a business, which is board evaluations and board development programs. If you would like to see a demo, join our community of users, get in touch. We are very happy, very personable to hear from you and show you what we do, how we do, and welcoming you to our community. Thank you so much.